The wind outside sounded like a hungry beast trying to tear the cabin apart. Mary pulled her wool shawl tighter around her shoulders as she watched through the small window. Snow was falling so thick she couldn't even see the barn that stood just 30 feet away. It was November 1878, and Mary had lived through many harsh winters in the Dakota Territory. But this storm felt different, meaner. The kind that could kill a person in minutes if they got caught outside without shelter. She walked to the fireplace and added another log. The flames danced and crackled, throwing warm light across her simple, one-room cabin. Mary had built this life from nothing after her husband died 3 years ago. She taught children in the nearby settlement when weather allowed, and kept a few chickens and a milk cow to get by. The storm had been building for 2 days now. Yesterday morning she'd seen the signs, the way the animals acted nervous, how the air felt heavy and still before the wind came. She'd spent the whole day preparing, brought extra firewood inside, checked that her animals had enough feed and water, made sure her windows were sealed tight. Now she was glad she'd prepared so well. The wind was howling like nothing she'd ever heard. It shook her little cabin and made the roof timbers creak. Snow was piling up against her door so high she wondered if she'd be able to get out when the storm passed. Mary heated some beans and cornbread for supper. She ate by the fire, listening to the storm rage outside. The sound was almost like voices sometimes, angry voices shouting and screaming. She tried not to think about anyone who might be caught out in this weather. Surely everyone had taken shelter by now. She pulled out her mending and tried to focus on fixing a torn dress. The steady work of her needle helped calm her nerves. Outside, the wind kept howling. Snow kept falling. The storm showed no signs of stopping anytime soon. Around midnight, Mary banked the fire and went to bed. She pulled every blanket she owned over herself but still felt cold. The wind seemed to be getting stronger instead of weaker. It rattled her windows and made the whole cabin shake. She must have dozed off because suddenly she was awake again. Something had changed. The wind was still howling, but there was something else. A different sound mixing in with the storm. Mary sat up in bed and listened hard. There it was again. A sound that didn't belong. It was faint, almost lost in the roar of the wind, but it sounded almost like someone crying out. She got up and put on her robe and slippers. Maybe she was just imagining things. Storms could play tricks on your ears, make you hear things that weren't there. But as she stood by the window, trying to peer out into the swirling snow, she heard it again, clearer this time. It definitely sounded like voices, human voices, and they sounded like they were in trouble. Mary's heart started beating faster. Anyone caught outside in this storm would freeze to death in minutes. She had to do something. But what could she do? She couldn't even see 10 feet outside her door. She put more wood on the fire and lit her oil lamp. Then she went to the wooden chest where she kept her late husband's things. Inside was a coil of rope, thick, strong rope, that Tom had used for hauling lumber. The voices came again, fainter now. Whoever was out there was getting weaker. Mary made up her mind. She put on her heaviest coat, her warmest boots, her thickest gloves. She wrapped a wool scarf around her face until only her eyes showed. Then she tied one end of the rope around her waist and the other end around the leg of her heavy wooden table. The cold hit her like a slap when she opened the door. Snow immediately whipped into her face, stinging her eyes and taking her breath away. The wind was so strong it nearly knocked her over. She could barely see anything. The snow was falling so thick and fast that it was like being inside a white cloud. She took a step outside, then another, following the rope that would guide her, back home. The voices came again. They were definitely real, and they were coming from somewhere near her property line. She pushed forward through snow that was already up to her knees. Every step was a struggle. The wind kept trying to push her, sideways. Snow got inside her coat and down her boots. Her face felt numb already, even with the scarf wrapped around it. But she kept going. Someone needed help, and she was probably the only person for miles around who could give it. After what felt like forever, she saw something dark in the snow ahead. At first, she thought it might be a fallen tree branch, but as she got closer, she realized it was moving. It was two small forms huddled together in the snow. Children, two young boys, maybe 8 and 10 years old. They were barely moving, and she could see they were nearly frozen. Mary's training as a teacher had taught her to stay calm in emergencies, but seeing these children half buried in the snow, she felt panic rise in her throat. They looked almost dead already. She knelt down beside them and brushed snow away from their faces. Their lips were blue. Their skin was pale as ice. One boy's eyes fluttered open when she touched his face, but he seemed too weak to focus on her. The boys were dressed differently than the children from the settlement. Their clothes were made of hide and fur, decorated with beadwork. Their hair was long and black. Mary realized with a start that these were native children, probably Sioux from one of the tribes in the area. For just a moment, she hesitated. Relations between the settlers and the Sioux had been tense lately. There had been troubles, conflicts, fear on both sides. Many of her neighbors would say these boys were enemies. But looking at their small, frozen faces, Mary saw only children who needed help. Children who would die if she didn't act right now. She grabbed the smaller boy under his arms and started dragging him through the snow toward her cabin. The rope guided her back through the blinding storm. It was the hardest work she'd ever done. The boy was small, but snow made everything twice as heavy. Her muscles burned and her lungs felt like they were on fire from breathing the cold air. When she finally got him inside, she left him by the fire and went back for the second boy. This one was bigger and heavier. By the time she got him to the cabin, she was exhausted and shaking from cold and effort. Both boys were unconscious now. Mary knew she had to work fast to save their lives. She'd seen frostbite before, and she knew what to do. First, she got them out of their wet, frozen clothes. She wrapped them in every warm blanket she had and placed them close to the fire. Not too close. She knew that warming frozen skin too fast could cause more damage. Then she heated water and made warm broth. She forced small sips between their blue lips, trying to get warmth into their bodies from the inside. She rubbed their hands and feet gently, trying to get blood flowing again. The storm kept raging outside. Snow kept piling up against her door and windows. But inside her cabin, Mary worked through the night to save 2 young lives. The smaller boy started responding first. His eyes opened around dawn, and he looked around with confusion and fear. When he saw Mary's face, he tried to pull away from her. She spoke softly to him, the way she talked to frightened animals. She didn't know his language, but she hoped her tone would calm him. She offered him more warm broth, and after a moment of hesitation, he drank it. The older boy took longer to wake up. When he finally did, he was very weak, but Mary could see intelligence in his dark eyes. He looked at her, then at his friend, then around the cabin. She could almost see him trying to figure out what had happened. Both boys had some frostbite on their fingers and toes, but it didn't look too serious. Mary treated it the way her husband had taught her, gently warming the affected areas and keeping them clean and dry. By the second day of caring for them, the boys were much stronger. They could sit up and eat solid food, but they were still afraid of her. They spoke to each other in their own language, quick, worried conversations that Mary couldn't understand. She tried to communicate with them using gestures and simple drawings. She drew pictures in the ashes by the fireplace, pictures of snow, of her finding them, of bringing them inside. Slowly, the boys began to understand that she had saved their lives. The storm finally started to calm on the 3rd day. The wind died down, and the snow stopped falling so heavily. Mary knew that soon people would be out looking for these boys. Their families must be worried sick. She also knew she had to be careful. Some of the settlers in the area didn't trust the Sioux. They might not understand why she had helped these children, and she wasn't sure how the Sioux would react to finding their children in her cabin. But she had done what she thought was right. She had saved 2 young lives from the storm. Whatever happened next, she could face it knowing she had acted with kindness and courage. The boys seemed to sense that the storm was ending too. They looked toward the windows more often, and she could see hope starting to replace the fear in their eyes. They were strong children, survivors. Soon they would be reunited with their families. Outside, the Dakota Territory lay buried under feet of snow. The storm had been one of the worst anyone could remember. But inside Mary's small cabin, warmth and kindness had conquered the cold. Two young boys who should have died in the blizzard were alive and healing. Mary didn't know it yet, but her act of mercy would change her life forever. The storm was ending, but her real adventure was just beginning. The morning sun finally broke through the clouds after 3 days of the worst blizzard Mary had ever seen. She opened her door carefully, pushing against the snow that had piled up almost to her waist. The world outside looked completely different, everything buried under white drifts that sparkled in the bright light. Inside her cabin, the two Sioux boys sat by the fire eating bowls of hot porridge. They were much better now, but Mary could see they were still nervous around her. Every time she moved too quickly or made a sudden sound, they would tense up and watch her carefully. The smaller boy, who looked to be about 8 years old, had been the first to trust her a little. Yesterday he had even smiled when she gave him an extra piece of cornbread with honey. But the older boy remained suspicious. He watched everything she did with serious dark eyes, as if he was trying to figure out her real intentions. Mary understood their fear. She had heard the stories that both sides told about each other. White settlers spoke of savage raids and violence. She imagined the Sioux told their own stories about the dangers of white people. These children had probably been taught to fear people like her their whole lives. But she also saw how young they were, how far from home, how scared. Whatever their families had told them about white settlers, right now they needed her help to survive. On the 4th day, when both boys were strong enough to walk around the cabin, Mary decided to try harder to communicate with them. She started by pointing to herself and saying Mary several times. Then she pointed to each of them with a questioning look. The older boy understood first. He pointed to himself and said something that sounded like Little Wolf. Then he pointed to his friend and said another name that Mary heard as Running Bear. She repeated the names back and both boys nodded. Little Wolf and Running Bear. The names fit them somehow. The older boy did remind her of a young wolf, alert and careful, always watching for danger. The younger one had a bright, energetic spirit that made her think of a bear cub. Over the next few days, they developed their own way of talking. Mary would point to objects around the cabin, the fire, water, food, and say the English words. The boys would repeat their words in Lakota. Soon they all knew basic words in both languages. Mary learned that the boys had been out with a hunting party when the storm hit. They had gotten separated in the blinding snow and wandering for hours before she found them. They drew pictures, in the ashes to show her, stick figures of men on horses, then the snow covering everything, then the two small figures alone and lost. She drew pictures too, showing how she had heard their voices in the storm and followed the rope to find them. Little Wolf traced the rope in her drawing with his finger, then looked at the real rope still coiled by the door. He said something to Running Bear, and both boys looked at Mary with what she thought might be respect. As the days passed, the boys began to relax more around her. Running Bear, the younger one, was naturally cheerful and curious. He wanted to touch and examine everything in the cabin. Mary showed him her few books, her sewing supplies, her cooking pots. He was especially fascinated by her small mirror, making faces at himself and laughing. Little Wolf remained more serious, but Mary could see he was warming up to her too. He helped her with small tasks around the cabin without being asked. When she was cooking, he would add wood to the fire at just the right time. When she was mending clothes, he would hand her the thread before she reached for it. One evening, as they sat around the fire after supper, Running Bear pointed to Mary and said a word in Lakota. She didn't understand it, but Little Wolf nodded, seriously. Then they both looked at her with expressions she couldn't quite read. Later, using their simple mix of words and gestures, she learned they were calling her Braveheart Woman. They had decided this was her name because she had been brave enough to come out in the storm to save them. Mary felt tears in her eyes when she understood. These children, who had every reason to fear and distrust her, had instead given her a name that honored her courage. She pointed to herself and repeated, brave-heart woman in her broken Lakota, and both boys smiled. As the week went on, they settled into a comfortable routine. Mary would wake early and start the fire. The boys would help her prepare breakfast. Running Bear was good at stirring the porridge, and Little Wolf had learned to slice bread without cutting himself. After breakfast, Mary would work on her mending or other household tasks while the boys played quiet games or helped where they could. In the afternoons, they continued their language lessons. Mary was picking up more Lakota words, and the boys were learning English surprisingly quickly. They were clearly intelligent children who had been well raised by their families. But Mary knew this peaceful time couldn't last forever. The boys' families would be looking for them. As soon as the snow settled enough for travel, search parties would be out. She watched the boys looking toward the windows more often, and she could see they were thinking about home. She also worried about what would happen when the search party came. Would the Sioux warriors understand that she had helped their children? Or would they see only a white woman who had taken 2 of their boys? Her nearest neighbors lived more than 10 miles away, and she knew some of them wouldn't approve of what she had done. There had been tensions between the settlers and the Sioux tribes for years. Some people on both sides seemed to want conflict rather than peace. But looking at Little Wolf and Running Bear, Mary couldn't bring herself to regret her choice. These were good children from what seemed like good families. Someone had taught them to be polite and helpful. They said what sounded like prayers before meals and showed respect for their elders, in this case her. One morning, Running Bear woke up with tears in his eyes. He had been dreaming about his mother. He managed to explain with words and gestures. Mary comforted him as best she could, but she could see that both boys were getting homesick. That day she made a decision. She would take them outside to play in the snow. The exercise would be good for them and it might help lift their spirits. Also, if a search party was coming, they would be more likely to see the boys if they were outside. The boys were excited to get out of the cabin. They hadn't been outside since the night she found them. Mary bundled them up in extra clothes and opened the door. The snow was still deep, but it had settled and hardened enough to walk on. The boys immediately started a snowball fight, laughing and shouting in their own language. Mary watched them play, happy to see them acting like normal children again. They built a snowman together, with Mary showing them how, and the boys adding their own creative touches. Running Bear insisted on using pieces of charcoal for the eyes and mouth, while Little Wolf found sticks for the arms. As they played, Mary noticed Little Wolf glancing toward the horizon more and more often. He was looking for something, probably hoping to see riders coming to find them. That evening, as they sat around the fire, Little Wolf drew a new picture in the ashes. It showed several men on horses with one larger figure in the center. Mary understood this was probably his father, leading a search party. She drew a picture of herself opening the door to welcome the search party. Both boys studied her drawing carefully, and she could see they were trying to figure out what would happen when their families came. The next morning brought clear, cold weather. Mary woke up with a feeling that something was going to change soon. She could sense it in the way the boys acted too. They were restless and kept looking out the windows. After breakfast, she braided Running Bear's hair, which had gotten tangled during their play in the snow. As she worked, he chatted to her in Lakota and she responded in English. They couldn't understand each other's words, but somehow they understood each other's meaning. Little Wolf sat nearby, carving a piece of wood with his small knife. Mary had been nervous about letting him keep the knife, but she realized it was probably an important tool that his father had given him. He was making something small and careful, maybe a gift for someone back home. Around midday, Mary was hanging up clothes to dry when Little Wolf suddenly stood up straight and pointed toward the window. He said something urgent to Running Bear, who jumped up and ran to look outside. Mary followed their gaze and felt her heart skip a beat. In the distance, moving across the white landscape, she could see dark figures on horseback. The search party had finally come. The boys were excited, but also nervous. They talked quickly to each other in Lakota, and Mary could hear both hope and worry in their voices. They wanted to go home, but they were also concerned about what would happen to the white woman who had saved their lives. Mary smoothed down her hair and straightened her dress. She had no idea what the next few minutes would bring, but she knew Her life was about to change forever. The peaceful days with Little Wolf and Running Bear were coming to an end. Outside, the riders were getting closer. Mary could see there were 5 or 6 of them, and they moved with purpose across the snow. These were experienced warriors who had been searching tirelessly for 2 missing boys. She put her hands on the boys' shoulders and looked into their eyes. In her simple Lakota, she tried to tell them not to worry about her. She had done what was right, and she was prepared to face whatever came next. Little Wolf reached into his pocket and pulled out the small wooden carving he had. Mary's heart pounded as she watched the riders approach through her small window. 6 Sioux warriors on horseback moved across the snow-covered landscape with the steady determination of men who had been searching for days. The leader rode a magnificent black and white painted horse, and even from a distance, Mary could see the authority in the way he sat in the saddle. Little Wolf and Running Bear pressed their faces to the window, speaking excitedly to each other, in rapid Lakota. Mary caught a few words she had learned, father and home, but most of their conversation was beyond her understanding. What she could understand was the mix of joy and worry in their voices. The boys wanted to run outside immediately, but Mary gently held them back. She needed to think about how to handle this moment. These warriors had been searching for their missing children for over a week. They were probably exhausted, worried, and possibly angry. How would they react to finding their boys in the cabin of a white woman? Mary had heard stories from other settlers about encounters with Sioux war parties. Some stories spoke of violence and conflict. Others told of honor and dignity. She hoped these men would be more interested in getting their children back safely than in punishing her for helping them. The riders were close enough now that she could see their faces clearly. The leader was a man of maybe 40 years with long black hair decorated with eagle feathers and a face marked by weather and experience. His expression was stern and focused as he scanned her property, looking for signs of the missing boys. The other warriors spread out slightly as they approached, surrounding the cabin in a careful pattern that showed their military training. These were not random searchers. They were experienced fighters who knew how to handle potentially dangerous situations. Mary made her decision. She would meet them honestly and openly, showing them that she meant no harm to their children. She smoothed her dress one more time and walked to the door. "Stay here for just a moment," she told the boys in her broken Lakota. They understood enough to nod, though she could see they were eager to run to their families. Mary opened the door and stepped outside into the cold morning air. The snow crunched under her feet as she walked a few steps from her cabin. She kept her hands visible and empty, hoping the warriors would see she was not armed or threatening. The leader brought his horse to a stop about 20 feet away. Up close, Mary could see the worry lines around his eyes and the way his jaw was set with tension. This was a father who had been sick with fear for his missing children. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the snow. Mary tried to read his expression, but his face revealed nothing of what he was thinking. The other warriors remained mounted, watching her carefully but letting their leader handle the situation. Finally, Mary did the only thing she could think of. She pointed toward her cabin and called out in English, "Little Wolf, Running Bear, your family is here." The effect was immediate. The door burst open and both boys came running through the snow toward the warriors. Running Bear was crying and laughing at the same time as he ran toward the leader's horse. Little Wolf moved more carefully, but Mary could see the relief and joy on his face. The leader's stern expression cracked the moment he saw his sons. He jumped down from his horse and caught Running Bear in a fierce hug, lifting the boy off his feet and spinning him around. Little Wolf reached them a moment later, and the 3 of them embraced in a way that made Mary's eyes fill with tears. The other warriors relaxed visibly when they saw the boys were safe and healthy. Several of them were smiling now, and Mary heard what sounded like prayers of thanksgiving in their own language. The leader, who Mary now realized must be the boy's father, held his sons at arm's length and looked them over carefully. He spoke to them quickly in Lakota, and Mary could hear the urgency in his questions. He was checking to make sure they were truly all right. Both boys started talking at once, pointing toward Mary and her cabin, obviously telling their father how she had saved them from the storm. Mary heard her Lakota name, Brave Heart Woman. several times in their excited explanation. The warrior's attention turned back to Mary. He said something to one of his men, who dismounted and came forward. This second man was younger, maybe in his 20s, and when he spoke to Mary it was in careful but understandable English. "I am Swift Eagle," he said. "I speak for Iron Hawk." He gestured toward the leader. "Iron Hawk is father of these boys. He wants to know, did you help his sons?" Mary nodded. "Yes, I found them during the blizzard. They were nearly frozen. I brought them inside and cared for them." Swift Eagle translated her words into Lakota. Iron Hawk listened intently, his dark eyes never leaving Mary's face. When Swift Eagle finished, Iron Hawk asked another question. "He wants to know why you helped them," Swift Eagle told Mary. "You are white. His sons are Sioux. Many of your people and our people are enemies." Mary thought about her answer carefully. "Because they were children in danger," she said simply. "I couldn't let them die in the storm." When Swift Eagle translated this, something changed in Iron Hawk's expression. The sternness softened, replaced by what looked like surprise and perhaps respect. He spoke again to Swift Eagle. "Iron Hawk says his sons tell him you risked your life to save them. You went out in the storm when you could have stayed safe inside." "Anyone would have done the same thing," Mary said, though she knew that wasn't necessarily true. Iron Hawk shook his head when this was translated. He spoke for a longer time, his voice growing more serious. Swift Eagle listened carefully before turning back to Mary. "Iron Hawk says you are wrong. Not everyone would risk their life for children who are strangers. Not everyone would care for enemy children as if they were their own family. He says his sons tell him you fed them, kept them warm, treated their frost injuries, and comforted them when they were afraid." Mary felt her cheeks flush. "I only did what was right." Iron Hawk had been studying Mary closely while Swift Eagle translated. Now he walked toward her, moving slowly so as not to frighten her. When he was close enough to look directly into her eyes, he spoke in a voice that was quiet but carried clearly in the cold air. Swift Eagle translated, "Iron Hawk says he can see truth in your face. His sons are alive because of your courage and kindness. In our culture, this creates a debt that cannot be repaid with simple words or gifts." Little Wolf and Running Bear had been watching this conversation anxiously. Now Running Bear tugged on his father's sleeve and spoke rapidly in Lakota, pointing back toward the cabin. Little Wolf joined in, and Mary could hear her Lakota name repeated several times. Iron Hawk listened to his sons with growing surprise. Then he looked at Mary, with an expression she couldn't quite read. He turned to Swift Eagle and spoke for several minutes, gesturing toward the cabin and then toward Mary. "Iron Hawk's sons tell him many things," Swift Eagle said to Mary. "They say you learned their names and tried to speak their language. They say you taught them English words and showed them how to help with work around your home. They say you were patient and kind, even when they were afraid of you at first." Mary glanced toward the boys, who were beaming at her. "They are good children. They helped me too." Iron Hawk spoke again, and this time his voice carried a tone of decision, as if he was making an important announcement. The other warriors leaned forward to listen more carefully. Swift Eagle's eyes widened as he heard Iron Hawk's words. He looked at Mary with surprise before translating. "Iron Hawk says he has been thinking during the long days of searching. He says the old ways of fighting between our peoples bring only sadness and death, but here is proof that white and Indian can show kindness to each other." Iron Hawk stepped closer to Mary and placed his hand over his heart. He spoke directly to her in careful English words. "You save my sons. You, good woman." Then he turned to Swift Eagle and spoke rapidly in Lakota again. Swift Eagle listened with growing amazement before turning to Mary. "Iron Hawk makes you an offer that has never been made to a white person before," Swift Eagle said slowly. "He invites you to come and live with our tribe. You would be welcomed as family, protected as family, honored as family. You saved his children, so you become his family." Mary stared at Swift Eagle, not sure she had heard correctly. "He wants me to come live with your tribe?" "Yes. You would leave this place and come to our winter camp. Iron Hawk would build you your own lodge, or you could stay with his family. You would be safe there. No one would harm you. You would be brave heart woman, the white woman who showed courage and kindness to Sioux children. Mary looked around at the warriors, all of whom were watching her intently. She looked at Little Wolf and Running Bear, who were smiling hopefully. She looked at Iron Hawk, whose stern face now showed genuine warmth and respect. This is a great honor, Swift Eagle continued. Iron Hawk is a respected war chief. His protection would mean you are safe from any enemy, white or Indian. But you must understand, if you accept, you would be choosing to live among people your neighbors consider enemies. Mary's mind raced. Leave her cabin, her small farm, her life among the white settlers. Go live with a Sioux tribe. A week ago, the idea would have seemed impossible, even crazy. But as she looked, Mary walked back into her cabin with her mind spinning like a whirlwind. Iron Hawk's offer kept echoing in her thoughts. Come live with the Sioux tribe as family. Be protected and honored for saving his sons. It was the most extraordinary thing anyone had ever offered her. She looked around her small cabin with new eyes. This place had been her whole world for 3 years since her husband died. Every item here told a story of her struggle to build a life alone on the frontier. The quilt her mother had made, the books that had belonged to her husband, the simple furniture they had built together in happier times. Outside, she could hear the voices of Iron Hawk and his warriors as they rested and prepared for the journey back to their camp. Little Wolf and Running Bear were with their father, but she could see them through the window, pointing toward her cabin and talking animatedly. They were probably telling him more details about how she had cared for them. Mary sat down in her rocking chair by the fire and tried to think clearly about this impossible decision. If she went with Iron Hawk, she would be leaving everything familiar behind. Her teaching job at the settlement school, her few friends among the other settlers, the grave where her husband was buried. But what kind of life did she really have? Here? She lived alone, barely getting by on her small income from teaching. Her nearest neighbors lived miles away, and some of them had never fully accepted a woman living alone. The winters were harsh and lonely. She had no family left, no children of her own, no real security. And then there were the practical dangers. Tensions between settlers and the Sioux had been growing worse each year. There had been raids and conflicts, fear and hatred on both sides. Her isolated cabin made her vulnerable to attack from desperate men of any color who might see a woman alone as an easy target. She thought about Iron Hawk's face when he had seen his sons safe and healthy. The relief and gratitude in his eyes had been unmistakable. This was a man who understood the value of life, who honored those who showed kindness to his family. Swift Eagle had said Iron Hawk was a respected war chief. That meant his protection would be real and powerful. Among his people, she would be safe in a way she had never been safe living alone. But it also meant she would be choosing sides in a conflict that was growing more bitter every year. If she went to live with the Sioux, the white settlers would see her as a traitor. There would be no going back to her old life. Mary got up and walked to her small mirror. The woman looking back at her was 31 years old, with brown hair that was starting to show gray and lines around her eyes from squinting into prairie winds. She had been pretty once, but frontier life had worn her down. She looked tired, older than her years. What did she have to lose, really? And what might she gain? A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Iron Hawk standing there alone. He was even more impressive up close, tall and powerfully built, with intelligent dark eyes and a face that spoke of wisdom earned through hard experience. He spoke to her in slow, careful English. "May I come in?" Mary stepped back and gestured for him to enter. Iron Hawk looked around her cabin with interest, taking in the simple furniture, the books on the shelf, the mending basket by her chair. His gaze lingered on the small wooden wolf that Little Wolf had carved for her, now sitting on her table. "My sons tell me. You learn their names," Iron Hawk said in his deliberate English. "You try speak our words." "Yes," Mary said. "I wanted to help them feel less afraid." Iron Hawk nodded slowly. "This shows good heart. Many white people think Indian children are animals, not worth learning names. Mary felt a flush of anger at the thought. Your sons are wonderful. Children. Anyone could see that. Ironhawk's stern expression softened slightly. You see what many cannot see. This is why, he paused, searching for the right English words. This is why I make offer to you. He walked to her window and looked out at his warriors and his sons. I am chief of my band, 40 families. I have seen much war, much killing. White men kill my people. My people kill white men. Always more anger, more hate. Mary listened quietly as Ironhawk struggled to express himself in her language. She could see this was important to him, something he needed her to understand. But you... He turned back to face her. You show different way. You see Sioux children in snow, you do not think enemy. You think children need help. This is how things should be. I couldn't have lived with myself if I had let them die, Mary said simply. Yes, this is what makes you special. Hawk moved closer, his dark eyes intense. My people have old saying, one who saves a life becomes family. You save 2 lives. You become very important family. Mary could hear the sincerity in his voice even through his limited English. This wasn't just a polite gesture or a temporary reward. He was offering her a permanent place in his world. But I'm not Sioux, Mary said. I don't know your customs, your religion, your way of life. I would be so different from everyone else. Ironhawk considered this for a moment. My grandmother was Cheyenne. She came to our tribe when she married my grandfather. She learned our ways, but she also kept some of her own ways. She taught us things we did not know before. This made us stronger, not weaker. He gestured toward her books. You can read and write. This is useful skill. You can teach our children these things. You can help us understand white man's world better, as we help you understand ours. The idea was beginning to seem less impossible to Mary. She had been a teacher for years. She had always loved working with children, helping them learn and grow. Maybe she could find a way to be useful among Ironhawk's people. What about the other members of your tribe? She asked. Will they accept a white woman living among them? Ironhawk was quiet for a moment, and Mary could see he was thinking carefully about his answer. Some will be suspicious at first. There is much anger among my people about white settlers. We have lost much land, many friends and family. He paused, then continued. But I am their chief. When I say you are family, you are family. And when they see how you cared for Little Wolf and Running Bear, they will understand. Actions speak louder than skin color. Mary walked to her bookshelf and picked up her Bible. What about religion? I'm a Christian. Would I be allowed to keep my faith? The Great Spirit speaks to all people, Ironhawk said simply. Maybe white people and Indian people just hear different words for same truths. You keep your beliefs, we keep ours. If they are good beliefs, there will be no fighting. A commotion outside drew their attention to the window. Little Wolf and Running Bear were building another snowman with some of the warriors, all of them laughing and joking together. Mary smiled watching them play. Your sons are remarkable children, she told Ironhawk. They were polite and helpful even when they were scared and sick. You and their mother have raised them well. A shadow passed across Ironhawk's face. Their mother died 2 winters ago. Sickness came to our camp. She fought hard to live, but... He shrugged sadly. I raise my sons alone now. This is another reason your kindness means much to me. They needed woman's care, and you gave it freely. Mary felt a pang of sympathy for this man who had lost his wife and nearly lost his children too. She understood the loneliness of being without a partner, the fear of raising children alone in a dangerous world. The offer I make, Ironhawk continued, it is not just for you to live with us. If you want, you could help care for Little Wolf and Running Bear. They already love you like mother. The word hung in the air between them. Mary had always regretted not having children of her own. Her marriage had been happy but brief, ended by her husband's death before they could start a family. The thought of helping to raise these two brave, intelligent boys filled an empty place in her heart. Ironhawk must have seen something in her expression because he nodded knowingly. You think about this. Good. Important decisions need thinking. Moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing you should know. If you come with us, you will be under my protection always. Anyone who harms you, white or Indian, will answer to me. This is sacred promise. After he left, Mary sat back down in her chair and stared into the fire. The offer was even more generous than she had first understood. Not just a place to live, but a real role in the community. Not just safety, but belonging. Not just survival, but purpose. She thought about the past week with Little Wolf and Running Bear. How natural it had felt to care for them, to teach them, to comfort them when they were homesick. How proud she had felt when they learned new English words. How worried when they seemed sad. She thought about Ironhawk's quiet dignity, his obvious love for his children, his willingness to look past old hatreds and see her actions for what they truly were, simple human kindness. Outside, the sun was climbing higher in the sky. Soon she would have to give her answer. Mary stood up and walked to the wooden chest where she kept her most precious belongings. Her wedding ring, wrapped in a piece of silk. The last letter her mother had written before she died. A photograph of her and her husband taken on their wedding day. She picked up the photograph and studied the faces of the young couple who had been so hopeful about their future together. That life was gone, now ended by disease and loneliness and the harsh realities of frontier existence. Maybe it was time for a new life, a different kind of hope. Mary stood in her doorway and looked out at Ironhawk and his warriors preparing to leave. The sun was almost directly overhead now. Time was running out for her to make the most important decision of her life. Little Wolf and Running Bear stood nearby, holding the reins of a gentle spotted mare that one of the warriors had brought for her to ride. Their faces were full of hope and anxiety as they waited for her answer. Brave heart, woman, Running Bear said in his mixture of English and Lakota. You come with us? Please, Little Wolf nodded seriously. Our people, they want to meet woman who saved us. Father says you be important person in our camp. Mary's heart melted looking at these two boys who had become so dear to her in just a few short days. They had lost their mother, been through a terrifying ordeal in the blizzard, and now they were asking her to become part of their family. She looked at Ironhawk, who was checking his horse's gear while keeping one eye on her door. When their eyes met, he nodded respectfully but didn't pressure her. This was her choice to make freely. Mary went back inside her cabin one last time. She had already packed her most precious belongings in a leather bag: her Bible, her mother's letters, her wedding ring, a few photographs, and some practical items like her sewing kit and medical supplies. Everything else would stay behind. She picked up the small wooden wolf that Little Wolf had carved for her and tucked it carefully into her coat pocket. Then she took one final look around the place that had been her home for 3 years. It was just a simple cabin. One room with rough wooden walls, a stone fireplace, a few pieces of handmade furniture. But it represented her independence, her determination to survive on her own after her husband died. Leaving it felt like leaving part of herself behind. But as she thought about the loneliness of the past winters, the constant worry about money and safety, the empty years stretching ahead with no real purpose or connection to others, Mary knew she was making the right choice. She stepped outside and closed the door behind her. Ironhawk looked up expectantly. I want to come with you, Mary said clearly. I want to be part of your family. The effect of her words was immediate. Little Wolf and Running Bear whooped with joy and ran to hug her. Ironhawk's stern face broke into a smile that transformed his entire appearance. Even the other warriors, who had been trying to look impassive, grinned and nodded their approval. Ironhawk walked over to Mary and placed both hands on her shoulders. You make good choice, brave heart woman. You will not regret this. Swift Eagle came forward with the spotted mare. This is for you to ride. Her name is Gentle Wind. She has carried women and children safely for many years. Mary had learned to ride when she was younger. but it had been a long time since she had been on a horse. Swift Eagle helped her mount, adjusting the stirrups, and showing her how to hold the reins properly. Little Wolf and Running Bear rode double on a sturdy pony, chattering excitedly to each other in Lakota. Mary caught some of their words now. They were talking about showing her their camp, introducing her to their friends, teaching her more of their language. Iron Hawk mounted his painted stallion and raised his hand to signal the departure. As the small party began moving across the snow-covered prairie, Mary turned back for one last look at her cabin. It looked smaller already, just a tiny dark speck against the vast white landscape. She wondered who might find it next spring, whether anyone would ever know that a woman named Mary had lived there and tried to build a life from nothing. But then Little Wolf called out to her, pointing ahead toward something she couldn't yet see, and Mary turned her face toward her new future instead of dwelling on the past. The journey to the Sioux winter camp took 2 days. They traveled at a steady pace across rolling hills covered in snow, following trails that were invisible to Mary but clear as roads to Ironhawk and his men. At night they camped in a sheltered valley, building a fire and sharing food while the horses rested. Mary had been nervous about how the other warriors would treat her, but they were polite and respectful. Swift Eagle continued to translate when needed, and she began picking up more Lakota words by listening to their conversations. On the evening of the first day, as they sat around the campfire, Ironhawk told his men the full story of how Mary had saved his sons. Mary didn't need Swift Eagle to translate. She could see the warriors' reactions as Ironhawk described her going out into the deadly blizzard to rescue 2 children who were strangers to her. When Ironhawk finished his story, the oldest warrior, in the group, a man with gray hair and a deeply lined face, stood up and spoke directly to Mary in Lakota. Swift Eagle translated with obvious emotion in his voice. White Crow says he has lived 60 winters and seen much fighting between our peoples. He says you are the first white person he has met who acted from pure goodness with no thought of gain. He wants to give you a gift. White Crow reached into his pack and pulled out a beautiful beaded necklace. The intricate pattern was worked in blue, white, and red beads with small silver ornaments that caught the firelight. He placed it around Mary's neck with ceremony, speaking words that Swift Eagle said were a blessing for protection and long life. The other warriors murmured approval, and Mary felt tears in her eyes. These men had every reason to distrust white people, but they were welcoming her as one of their own based on her actions toward Ironhawk's children. On the second day, they crested a hill and Mary got her first view of the Sioux winter camp. It was larger than she had expected. Dozens of teepees arranged in organized rows along a frozen stream, with horse herds grazing on grass they found by pawing through the snow. Smoke rose from many fires, and she could see people moving about, their daily tasks. As their party approached the camp, word of their arrival spread quickly. People emerged from their teepees to watch, and Mary could see children running ahead to spread the news that Ironhawk had found his sons and brought them home safely. But she also saw the curious and sometimes suspicious looks directed at her. A white woman riding with a Sioux war party was not something these people saw every day. Some of the faces watching her arrival were friendly, but others were clearly wary. Ironhawk must have sensed her nervousness because he brought his horse closer to hers. "Do not worry," he said quietly. "They are curious, but they will welcome you when they understand why you are here." As they rode into the center of the camp, a large crowd gathered around them. Ironhawk dismounted and helped Little Wolf and Running Bear down from their pony. The boys immediately ran to a group of other children, talking excitedly about their adventure. Then Ironhawk raised his voice and addressed the crowd in Lakota. Mary couldn't understand most of what he said, but she heard her name. Brave Heart, Woman, repeated several times along with words she recognized as blizzard, saved, and children. As Ironhawk told the story, Mary watched the faces of the listeners change. The suspicion gradually gave way to surprise, then to respect and gratitude. When he finished speaking, an elderly woman pushed through the crowd and approached Mary. This woman had gray hair braided with colorful ribbons and a face that spoke of wisdom and authority. She looked up at Mary, still seated on her horse, and spoke in clear English. "I am Singing Bird, grandmother to Little Wolf and Running Bear. Iron Hawk's wife was my daughter. Her voice was formal, but not unfriendly. He tells us you saved our boys from the White Death in the storm. I did what anyone would do, Mary said, dismounting so she could speak to Singing Bird face to face. Singing Bird studied Mary's face intently for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. No, not anyone would do this thing. You risked your life for children who were not your blood, not your tribe. This is the action of a person with a good heart. She reached out and took Mary's hands in her own weathered ones. You are welcome in our camp, Braveheart woman. You will stay in my teepee until Ironhawk can build you your own lodge. The formality of the moment was broken when Running Bear came racing back through the crowd and threw his arms around Mary's waist. Grandmother, look. Braveheart woman came home with us. Singing Bird's stern expression melted into a smile as she watched her grandson's obvious affection for Mary. I can see she has already won the hearts of our boys. That tells me much about her character. Over the following days, Mary settled into her new life with surprising ease. Singing Bird proved to be a patient teacher, showing her how to prepare traditional foods, how to care for the teepee, and how to behave appropriately in various social situations. The other women in the camp were initially cautious around Mary, but they gradually warmed to her as they saw her willingness to learn and her genuine affection for Little Wolf and Running Bear. Some of the younger women were especially curious about her life before coming to the camp, asking through Swift Eagle about white people's customs and ways of living. Mary found herself busier and more useful than she had been in years. Ironhawk had been right about her skills being valuable. Several families asked her to teach their children to read and write English, believing these skills might be important for dealing with white traders and government officials. She also put her medical knowledge to good,